GLUT2 transporter that is in the beta cell. It also is in the liver. There are GLUT4 transporters as well. The GLUT4 transporters are unidirectional, meaning they will only bring glucose into cells. GLUT2 transporters can also move glucose out of cells. Okay, so GLUT2, GLUT4 transporters. So there are different numbers, GLUT1, GLUT2, there are 3, 4, obviously, there's probably more. The GLUT2 is your bidirectional one. In response to insulin, it brings glucose into the cell, but when insulin is low and the glucose is low outside, then the inside of the liver cells will start to break down glycogen, and then the GLUT2 will transport the glucose out into the blood. GLUT4 is usually not present in the plasma membrane in the absence of insulin. But there is an exception to that, and that is in exercising skeletal muscle. So when you're using your skeletal muscle, the skeletal muscle will move GLUT4 transporters into the plasma membrane. And that's referred to as an insulin-like effect of the exercise. So even without insulin present, glucose comes into actively contracting skeletal muscle. There was a young man when I worked with the Diabetes Association, the type 1 diabetic. He'd been diabetic since small kid time. He was in his early 20s, I guess, maybe mid-20s. He had around teenage years, he got really tired of sticking himself with needles all the time. So he decided he was going to figure out how he could exercise just the right amount to keep his blood glucose within normal ranges. And then when it got too low, he'd eat. When it got too high, he'd exercise. And he was able to do that. He was able to just take very few insulin injections and just watch what he ate and monitor the exercise level and keep his blood glucose within normal ranges. He did monitor his blood glucose with the finger stick, so I said that was tolerable. But all these needles going into his thighs and his tummy, and he just got sick and tired of that. The average person, when he came and he did bike-a-thon for raising funds for Diabetes Association, he talked to other diabetics, and they're all like, "Oh, you do what? You do how many? How much do you exercise?" And there's like, no way we're gonna be able to do that ourselves. They don't have the motivation to do it. They don't have the attention span to pay attention to all of this. But he was highly motivated to do it. So he was using this insulin-like effect of exercising muscle to get the glucose out of the bloodstream and then into skeletal muscle. Still have to take low levels of insulin because other cells don't have insulin-like effects. They don't exercise. Your brain doesn't exercise. It does, but it doesn't. It still needs insulin. Other tissues still need insulin, but less needles. That made him happy. Glucagon is secreted when the cells sense a lack of glucose coming into them. So they will, when glucose levels are low, the alpha cells release glucagon, and that will mobilize energy stores, and of course the liver will release glucose, but then your fats and your amino acids, if you're not using your skeletal muscle, will get converted into glucose to elevate your blood glucose concentration, get them back into the normal range. So it's normally acting in opposition to insulin. So this little phrase here, in general, it opposes the actions of insulin. Also, so next semester we'll talk a little bit about this in general part. But the cells that are starved of glucose because insulin is not present, they, as I said before, will send messages to the alpha cells to release glucagon. And then the presence of glucagon is not to get blood glucose back into the normal range. What it ends up doing is getting it above the normal range and maybe into the range where it's so high that now it's appearing in the urine. So that brings us to diabetes mellitus. There are actually two types of diabetes mellitus. Mellitus means sweet. That means your urine is sweet. How did they know that the urine was sweet? They tasted it. They stuck their little finger in. Oh, it has sugar in it. And so that's why they named this disease that had hyper urinary output. So like diuretic, but it's diabetes, and then sweet urine coming out, mellitus. Nowadays, well, once they figured out, or they were too disgusted to taste it, then they just leave it out, and if flies came, they knew there was sugar, and if there's ants that came, they knew there was sugar, so they knew that individual was probably had diabetes mellitus. So there's two kinds. The most common is where about 80% of your pancreas has shut down and is not producing insulin. And it could be more than that, but at least 80% of your beta cells are non-functional and producing insulin, and then blood glucose levels will become elevated. So you can be born with this condition, but generally it develops. The babies that are born diabetic usually don't live very long, but children who develop type 1 diabetes, they can continue to grow. Their growth might be stunted slightly, but they can continue to grow and live normal lives as long as they get diagnosed and get the insulin that they need via injection. So type 1 diabetes, also referred to as insulin-dependent diabetes. Type 2 diabetes used to be referred to as non-insulin-dependent diabetes, but now they're treating type 2 diabetics with low levels of insulin early on in the treatment, because a lot of type 2 diabetics don't respond adequately to diet, exercise, and oral medication, and ultimately end up having to take insulin. And if they find that what the clinicians have found is if an individual suddenly has to take insulin, they feel like, I'm a failure, I can't do anything right, they get depressed, and now they got more problems than just the disease. If you introduce insulin early and they get used to giving an occasional injection, they're less bent out of shape by having to increase the insulin dosage. They feel less like a failure and more like, well, this is just a change in my treatment regime. Type 2 diabetics, the simplest form of type 2 diabetes is you're just too darn fat, and your adipose cells are so stretched out by all these triglycerides that the insulin that's being secreted is probably in higher amounts than needed because all the cells elsewhere in your body are starved of the of the glucose getting in, but this normal to even elevated concentration of insulin is not sufficient to find the receptors on the adipose cells, where you store the majority of the excess glucose that you're taking in. So if you exercise and you shrink the cell back down to a normal size, then concentration of insulin receptors are back into the normal range, and now the insulin is binding to the receptor and glucose is going into cells, and you're cured. Your diabetes has gone away. Some people don't have that problem. Maybe this insulin molecule is abnormal and it doesn't bind to the receptor efficiently. Or maybe the receptor is abnormal and can't bind the normal insulin molecule. So you've got an insensitivity of the receptor and hormone interaction. Or you've got a problem inside with the receptor activating the second messenger system inside the cell, so transduction problem. So you've got all these different kinds of medications out there to treat type 2 diabetes. Make the insulin more likely to bind by changing the shape of the receptor, making the signal transduction occur more efficiently, and then you help with mobilization or movement of glucose into the cell. Whether you have type 1 or type 2 diabetes, the symptoms are very similar. The phenotype may be different in that the type 2 diabetic tends to be obese. The type 1 diabetic tends to be on the skinny side. They're attacking their skeletal muscle for energy, and they're mobilizing their fat for glucose production, but their glucose is elevated, so they have sweet urine, but it's not getting into the cells. So symptom-wise, they're frequently urinating, and when they go to the bathroom, probably a liter and a half of urine is coming out every time they're going to the bathroom. Several liters, multiple liters per day are coming out of these people. They're just always headed to the bathroom. Because so much urine is coming out, they're drinking water to replace that volume. So polydipsia means a lot of thirst. They're drinking a lot of water. The glucose is in the urine, so they're going to be replacing the glucose by eating a lot of food. So polyphagia, they're eating a lot of food. The conversion of fats to glucose is okay, but a lot of times fats start to get converted to ketone bodies, and you go into a state of ketosis, which is acid. Ketones are acid, and so now you've got a metabolic acidosis to deal with. When you get ketotic, when you have a ketosis, the smell of acetone is on the breath. So when you see somebody passed out on the sidewalk and you're walking by, just sniff kind of strongly. If you smell nail polish remover, acetone in that area, you will smell it 4 or 5 feet away from that individual. That's how strong the smell is. When you smell that, call 911, because that's a diabetic in need of help really quickly. And probably you just go up there and shake them like you're supposed to. Are you okay? Are you okay? No response. Go through their purse or their wallet or their pockets. They probably have some kind of gel that is a glucose gel, or they have packets of sugar that they carry with them for this type of a problem. And then you can just put a little under their tongue. Don't throw it in their throat because they'll choke on it, but put some sugar or some gel under their tongue, and it will get absorbed, and then the glucose levels will come back up. They might be needing insulin injection. You can't tell that yourself. So all you can safely do is give them a little bit more sugar just in case that's the problem. Call 911, let them figure out whether they need an insulin injection or not. With catabolism of The muscles, they're going to get weaker, they're going to be lethargic, they're going to have bones sticking out through the muscles. So type 1 diabetics tend to have this muscle wasting. Even type 2 diabetics, they don't look that like they're wasting away, but if you go and you pinch the fat off, you find that there's this ton of fat there and there's hardly any muscle underneath. So the muscle is wasting, but the fat is covering it up. So they look more or less healthy, although obese, but they still are lacking the muscle there. Chronically, when the diabetes is uncontrolled for a long period of time, the glucose starts to get red blood cells sticking together. You saw that in lab at the beginning of the semester. If you put red blood cells into 0.5 molar glucose, which is 500 milliosmoles of glucose, that's just 200 milliosmoles above normal, but red blood cells start to stick together and they precipitate. That happens in the circulatory system, then their blood's not getting through capillaries, tissue downstream gets hypoxic, the cells may start to die, and you end up with gangrene in the extremities. So you get gangrene, you gotta start chopping off that dead tissue, because gangrene produces gases which poison and kill other tissues, so you gotta surgically remove that dead dying tissue. The protein breakdown that's occurring here, muscle wasting, causes more proteins to be filtered at the kidney, which puts pressure on the kidneys. The filtration barrier will always trap proteins, and you've got phagocytic cells that come in to clean out the filtration barrier. When a lot of protein's there, that phagocytosis increases. To phagocytose the proteins, you release proteases to break down the proteins so that the phagocytes can ingest them. But there's collagen there that is part of your basement membrane, and if those proteases break down your basement membrane, then your kidneys start to become leaky to large proteins. And that's usually a sign that your kidneys are on the way to failure. And that means you're going to be going to dialysis to survive and looking for a kidney transplant. So kidney failure is a result of uncontrolled diabetes and the metabolism of muscle. The shorter life expectancy, diabetics also have high blood pressure, which puts pressure on the heart, hearts could go into failure. The glycosylation of blood vessels, glycosylation of the nervous system interferes with blood flow and nervous system transmission. Start to lose eyesight, you start to lose sensitivity in your fingers. Little cuts in diabetics get infected, they don't know it because they don't feel the pain of the infection, the inflammation, and so it is more likely to become infected and gangrenous, and you start losing body parts. The summary of what's going on here, I'm not going to go over it with you, but everything that we've talked about, glucose in the urine, that increases water going out, your production of ketones creates a metabolic acidosis. If you don't control that, you go into a coma, you die. If you don't get your water back, your body shrivels up and you die. If you go into renal failure, you might wish you were dead, but you're on dialysis, and that prolongs a long, slow death process. You might get a kidney transplant, you might not, so it's not a good thing to go that route either. So anyway, look at this for a summary of what we've talked about. Calcium metabolism, I've got a video to show you about your parathyroid.
Humans have 4 parathyroid glands on the posterior surface of the thyroid gland. The glands secrete parathyroid hormone when the calcium level in the blood drops. This hormone acts on cells in the bone and the kidney. Click the graphics to learn how it affects these targets. Parathyroid hormone induces living cells to secrete enzymes that digest bone and release calcium. Parathyroid hormone enhances calcium reabsorption in the kidneys. It also induces some kidney cells to secrete enzymes that act on precursors of vitamin D. The activated form stimulates intestinal cells to absorb more calcium from food passing through the gut.
Does everybody have parathyroid? No. So remember that. 3 ways to increase your blood calcium. Take it out of your bone, put it in the blood, reabsorb it when it's filtered at the kidneys, and then also have the kidneys produce calcitriol that then causes your intestines to absorb more calcium. So 3 ways to get blood calcium levels back up. So excitation, coupling, contraction in the cardiac and smooth muscle relies on extracellular calcium. That's why you have to keep your blood calcium in a normal range. Stimulus in the secretion of things like insulin. If you don't get enough calcium into the beta cell, then you don't get enough calcium released by exocytosis. Tight junctions. If you go back, we didn't really talk about this so much, but you see tight junctions are linked to the terminal web in the cell, and that has actin and myosin in it. So maintenance of your tight junction is due to actin and myosin interaction, which relies on calcium. Blood clotting, several places in the clotting cascade you have calcium as one of the clotting factors. So without calcium, you get no blood clotting. In fact, when you go into MedTech, you find you go in to get your blood taken, they take the blood into a test tube and shake it up. The test tube is coated with usually something that chelates the calcium in the blood. So calcium binds to the glass surface and to those enzymes, and then it can't activate the clotting cascade. They can store your blood until they have time to analyze your blood. So it prevents the clotting. The calcium metabolism, you've got parathyroid hormone that wants to elevate blood calcium. You've got calcitonin that wants to decrease blood calcium, and vitamin D that is going to help you absorb more calcium, so it's going to work with parathyroid hormone to keep blood calcium levels up. Parathyroid hormone does one other thing. In order to keep calcium free in your plasma, it's going to take phosphate and it's going to tell the kidneys, get rid of this phosphate, because calcium and phosphate getting back together, it's going to either get deposited back into the bone or it's going to get deposited into tissues where it doesn't belong and calcify those tissues. You don't want calcium and phosphate getting back together unless you specifically want it back in the bone. So calcitonin will take phosphate and calcium and put those back together and put it into the bone. But when parathyroid hormone is high, parathyroid will mobilize the calcium, phosphate comes along, but parathyroid hormone doesn't want calcium and phosphate getting back together, so it tells the kidneys to dump the phosphate, but oh, by the way, if you see calcium, reabsorb that. So reabsorb the calcium, but secrete the phosphate. So these decrease in blood calcium, PTH is released. Increase in calcium, calcitonin is released, but calcitonin is more involved in calcium going into the bone in children who are growing than in adults who have finished growing. So less of an effect in an adult. Okay, so this is what I talked to you about. Promotes calcium movement from the bone into the fluid, plasma, calcium absorption into the kidney, activation of vitamin D3 for the intestines to absorb more calcium, and then also get rid of the phosphate. So these huge cells, the osteoclasts, they will release, actually pump hydrogen, and chloride will follow out into this reabsorptive area called the resorption bay. The osteoclasts bind to the bone laterally, actually all the way around. So they seal in this hydrochloric acid. The bone is then dissolved. The cell endocytoses, calcium and phosphate, and then exocytoses it on the other side. The blood calcium level then goes up, and your parathyroid hormone then decreases its concentration. So the rest of this, we're not going to really cover this because we covered bone already. The gap junctions between the osteocytes we've already talked about. That's just a way of passing nutrients in and out through the layers of the calcified matrix. So bone dissolving, you have ATP involved in getting the calcium out of the osteoclast into the interstitial fluid, and then it will go into the blood plasma. You have a fast exchange, a slow exchange of that calcium. The fast exchange is from the calcium that's already freed up from the bone. Slower, you have to get it from the bone into the osteoclast, and then from the osteoclast into this interstitial fluid area that's in the canaliculi. So back here in the space there, that's where ultimately the calcium will end up, and then you've got to get it diffusing out of that area and then into the bloodstream. So we looked at that video already. So vitamin D stimulates calcium and phosphate absorption at the intestine. The phosphate, if it's needed if calcitonin is present, calcium and phosphate go together and get deposited into the bone. If parathyroid hormone is high, and that's the reason vitamin D went to the intestine to absorb the calcium, phosphate's coming in as well, but the kidneys have a signal to get rid of that phosphate. So sort of a wasteful absorption if you're just going to go right on and excrete it. But this is handled electrically. So you have to have an electrically neutral uptake of calcium. So you've either got to secrete something that's positive or absorb something that's negative. And the intestine chooses to absorb the phosphate and the calcium together, and it's relatively electrically neutral. Vitamin D ultimately starts in cholesterol in the skin that's exposed to sunlight, and then you can also get it by drinking milk that has vitamin D, or orange juice that has vitamin D, or taking calcium that has vitamin D in it. It goes to the liver, then it goes to the kidney, and gets an OH added at 3. So first OH at the skin, second at the liver, third at the kidney, and now you have calcitriol that is then the active form of vitamin D3 that can help with calcium absorption at the intestine. So first OH added, second OH at the liver, third OH at the kidney, and then you got the active vitamin D3 for absorption of phosphate. And calcium. Calcitonin takes the calcium, combines it with phosphate, puts it into the bone. That lowers blood calcium levels. Calcitonin also will inhibit osteoclast reabsorption of bone. Does, again, more of this in children than in adults. The calcitonin in rare conditions where you have hypercalcemia is when you have rare conditions where hypercalcemia is present, calcitonin is efficient, but just maintaining normal calcium levels in the adult, it's not very helpful. So postmenopausal females, they used to try and treat them with calcitonin. They tried with IV calcitonin, very bad side effects. Intranasal calcitonin, the nasal passage got irritated and people couldn't breathe through their nose, and it just wasn't worth it. They found it wasn't helping in the long run. They finally found out that calcitonin wasn't that important in the adult. So they went on to looking at bisphosphates and some other medications, the alendolates that change the activity of the osteoblasts and osteoclasts through other mechanisms, and that tended to help more with postmenopausal osteoporosis. Okay, I'm going to start a little bit on the nervous system. It's just pretty much review of things we've already talked about. So nervous system and endocrine system work together. Nervous system is fast on, fast off, but endocrine system is slow to turn on, slow to turn off, so it can continue to stimulate the organs that the nervous system activates. The nervous system is also using chemicals, but they're called neurotransmitters because they're coming out of nerves. And they're not going into the blood necessarily on purpose. They might diffuse into the blood, especially if they're epinephrine and norepinephrine, it can get into the blood. But generally, the nervous system will control the communication within the synaptic cleft by having enzymes that will break down the neurotransmitter before it gets into the blood. So nervous system, fast on, fast off, endocrine, slow on, but lasts longer, so slow off. Central nervous system, peripheral nervous system. Central nervous system is brain and spinal cord. If you are outside the cranial cavity, outside the vertebral cavity, you are in the peripheral nervous system. Cranial nerves are, for the most part, peripheral nerves. All your spinal nerves, your splanchnic nerves, these are all peripheral nervous system. Central nervous system is going to integrate the sensory information and then coordinate motor responsive. Your intelligence, your memory, your ability to learn, to react to different stimuli emotionally, to thermoregulate in all different kinds of basic functional responses, that's all done at the central nervous system level and then carried out by information that is taken out to the effector organs by the peripheral nervous system. Peripheral nervous system is a combination of sensory input and motor output. And they will go to specific parts of the brain and specific parts of the spinal cord. The PNS, or peripheral nervous system, is broken down into two divisions, autonomic and somatic. Somatic controls your skeletal muscle, and then your autonomic will control glands and blood vessels and your organs, like your heart and your lungs and your kidneys and your intestines. The afferent division is directional term that also is synonymous with sensory. So afferent going toward, and that is sensory information going to the central nervous system for integration. There's sensory from your organs via the autonomic nervous system, and there's sensory from the somatic nervous system, telling you about touch, pressure, temperature change, chemical changes, all of those kinds of modalities that tell you about your environment and your interaction with your environment. That information is transduced, it's taken from photons of light or chemicals on your tongue or pressure on your skin, and turned into action potentials and then sent via the afferent nerves to the spinal cord or the brain for integration. The motor response is efferent. So motor and efferent are synonymous. They mean the same thing. Information leaving the central nervous system and then going back to the same general area where the sensory information came from for the particular motor response. Autonomic nervous system, self-regulating. You don't have to sit here and think, I must cause my heart to beat 60 beats per minute, 70 beats per minute. I must digest my food. I must create urine and then evacuate my urine, or not evacuate my urine. You can't actually control that. But urinary production, you don't think about that. That's under your autonomic nervous system control. Moving your skeletal muscle, that's volitional, that's voluntary, you can do that. Knowing where your body is in space, that's via your stretch receptors associated with your extrafusive fibers. We've got sensory input from muscle, we've got sensory input from the skin and other receptors. So breaking it down in these little boxes, central nervous system. Things going into the central nervous system are sensory or afferent. They come from our special senses, our hearing, our vision, our taste, our balance. So you have all of those smell as well. That is a special part of your sensory system, separated from pressure, touch, vibration, temperature changes. Those are somatosensory. These others are special sensory. Visceral sensory comes from your heart, your lungs, from your GI system. Those, you have information from your organs, but it's very kind of blurry. If you have pain in your heart, usually your brain misinterprets it as tightness in your chest, and in the men, pain radiating down your arm. So those kinds of sensory inputs oftentimes get misinterpreted by the brain. We'll talk more specifically about why when we get to the tracts that carry the information in, where they end up in the central nervous system. The processing is involving interneurons, and that may involve information going up or down in the central nervous system, or it might simply be a reflex that comes in and is processed really quickly, and then you have a motor response going right out. We've got somatomotor that is going back to where the somatosensory information came from. Got your autonomic motor broken down into the para and the sympathetic nervous system that we've already talked about, controlling your heart, your glands, your other organs, as well as smooth muscle. So these are the effectors, your skeletal muscle for the somatic nervous system, and everything else pretty much for the autonomic nervous system. So typical neuron, we've talked about this already, cell body, dendrites. Dendrites can be short, sometimes can be very, very long, like the dendrites that come from your fingertip up to the cell body that's located in your dorsal root ganglion. That's where your cell body is, and then an axon that goes into your central nervous system. Motor neurons will have cell body in the central nervous system, and then the axon going back out to the peripheral effector organs. All neurons have, well, not all neurons, but most neurons will have dedicated cell processes bringing information to the cell body, and then one axon that will take information away from the cell body. But we'll talk next about the subgroups of neurons. Well, neuroglia and then neurons. So picking up with neurons.